The Cold War began when the United States realized it was facing more than a rival nation. It was facing a system that expanded by testing limits. The question was simple: how do you stop an enemy without starting another world war? This is a story about how the world split in two. Not through a single dramatic event, but through a series of decisions, miscalculations, and recognitions that accumulated until the division became entrenched. The bombs that ended the Second World War had barely stopped falling when a new kind of conflict began taking shape. A conflict that would last for more than 40 years and define the lives of generations. The transition from alliance to rivalry happened faster than anyone expected. In 1945, American and Soviet soldiers met at the Elbe River in Germany, celebrating their joint victory over fascism. Photographs from that day show smiling faces, handshakes across the water, the relief of men who had survived the most destructive war in human history. By 1947, those same nations were organizing their spheres of influence into opposing camps that would face each other across a divided Europe for decades. What happened in between was not war in any traditional sense. There was no direct military conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. No formal declarations of hostility passed between them. Instead, there was something more ambiguous and in some ways more dangerous. A contest for influence that played out through political pressure, economic leverage, and the steady consolidation of control in territories where the outcome was not yet decided. Understanding how this happened requires looking closely at the decisions that shaped it. Not just the grand pronouncements that made headlines, but the calculations happening in offices and conference rooms. The assessments of what the other side was doing. The growing conviction on both sides that the other could not be trusted. The moments when alternative paths closed off and the trajectory toward confrontation became fixed. Historical records and first-hand accounts from this period reveal a pattern that would define the Cold War from its earliest days. Each side interpreted the other's actions through the lens of suspicion. Each side's defensive measures looked like offensive preparations to the other. Each step toward security created insecurity on the opposite side of the emerging divide. This dynamic, once established, proved almost impossible to break. The people who made these decisions were not fools or warmongers. They were leaders grappling with genuine uncertainties in a world that had just been shattered by the worst war in human history. They were trying to prevent another catastrophe while managing immediate crises that demanded action. The tragedy is that their reasonable responses to perceived threats created the very confrontation they hoped to avoid. The new war did not begin with bombs. It began with decisions. To understand why the Cold War happened, you have to understand what the world looked like when the Second World War ended. The scale of destruction was almost beyond comprehension. Cities that had stood for centuries were rubble. Economies that had taken generations to build were shattered. Political systems that had governed millions had collapsed entirely. Europe in 1945 was a continent of ruins, refugees, and uncertainty. Tens of millions of people were dead. Entire communities had been wiped out. Entire regions had changed hands multiple times as armies advanced and retreated across them. This was the kind of chaos where politics turns into survival. Many more millions were displaced, wandering across a devastated landscape in search of homes that might no longer exist. The roads of Europe were clogged with refugees moving in every direction. Former prisoners of war trying to return home. Survivors of concentration camps with nowhere to go. Ethnic populations expelled from territories where their families had lived for generations. The movement of peoples was on a scale that had no precedent in European history. The infrastructure that made modern life possible had been systematically destroyed. Railroads had been primary targets for bombing campaigns on all sides. Bridges had been blown up by retreating armies. Factories had been dismantled and shipped east by the Soviets or bombed into rubble by Allied air forces. Power plants were damaged or destroyed. The basic systems that allowed cities to function, water, sewage, electricity, transportation, were compromised across the continent. And survival creates radical choices. Food was desperately short. The disruption of agriculture during the war years, combined with the destruction of transportation networks, meant that even areas that could produce food could not easily move it to areas that needed it. The winter of 1946-47 would be one of the coldest on record, and the suffering it caused in an already weakened Europe would be severe. People were hungry in ways that Americans, whose homeland had been spared the war's destruction, found difficult to fully comprehend. The human cost extended beyond the physical. Entire age groups of young men had been killed in combat. Civilian populations had been bombed, starved, and massacred. The Holocaust had murdered 6 million Jews along with millions of others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. Societies that emerged from this catastrophe were traumatized in ways that would take decades to process. The psychological wounds were as real as the physical ones, even if they were less visible. The political landscape was equally shattered. The governments that had led European nations before the war were gone or discredited. Collaborationist regimes had replaced them in occupied territories, and those regimes had now collapsed along with the German power that had installed them. The question of what would come next, who would govern, under what principles, with what relationship to the great powers that had won the war, was entirely open. For Americans watching from across the Atlantic, the situation presented both an opportunity and a danger. The opportunity was to help rebuild a stable, peaceful Europe that would never again produce the kind of catastrophic wars that had twice drawn America into bloody conflicts. American leaders understood that the prosperity and security of the United States was connected to the stability of Europe in ways that isolationism had tried to deny. The danger was that the chaos and desperation would create conditions for new forms of extremism, new authoritarian movements, new threats to the peace that had been won at such tremendous cost. Hungry people are susceptible to radical promises. Desperate populations will turn to anyone who offers order and hope. The void left by the destruction of the old order would be filled by something. And the question was what that something would be. The memories of the 1930s weighed heavily on American thinking. The Great Depression had destabilized democracies across Europe. Economic hardship had fueled the rise of fascism and Nazism. The failure of the Western powers to confront aggression early had allowed small crises to grow into a global conflagration. American policymakers were determined not to repeat those mistakes. They had learned, or believed they had learned, that disengagement from European affairs led to disaster. But there was another player in this landscape of destruction, and that player had its own interests, its own fears, and its own plans for the post-war order. The Soviet Union had suffered more than any other Allied nation in the war against Germany. Roughly 20 million or more Soviet citizens died. The destruction extended across the western regions of the country. Cities had been reduced to rubble. Villages had been burned. The industrial base that Stalin had built through brutal forced collectivization had been partially destroyed and would need to be rebuilt through enormous effort. The agricultural regions of Ukraine, among the most productive in the world, had been fought over repeatedly and would take years to recover. The human losses were felt in every family, every community, every institution. A generation of young men had been killed or maimed. Women had been left to raise children alone, to work in factories, to keep society functioning while the men fought and died. The trauma of invasion, occupation, and total war had marked the entire population. For the Soviet leadership, the paramount lesson of the war was that the country must never again be left vulnerable to invasion from the West. The German attack in 1941 had come close to destroying the Soviet state entirely. The Wehrmacht had advanced to the outskirts of Moscow before being turned back. Leningrad had endured a siege of nearly 900 days in which hundreds of thousands of civilians starved to death. Only at enormous cost in blood and suffering had the invasion been defeated. The determination to prevent any repetition of that experience would shape Soviet policy for decades. In the minds of Soviet leaders, security meant control. It meant ensuring that the territories between the Soviet Union and potential enemies were in friendly hands. It meant never again trusting the goodwill of capitalist powers who had, after all, intervened against the Bolshevik Revolution and might do so again if given the opportunity. What this meant in practice was a drive to establish a buffer zone of friendly, which in Soviet terms meant compliant, governments in the territories between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. From Moscow's perspective, this was a legitimate security requirement. The Soviet Union had been invaded through these territories twice in living memory, first in the First World War, and then by the Nazis. Ensuring that future governments in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and elsewhere would not become staging grounds for another attack was a matter of national survival. The experience of 1941 haunted Soviet military thinking. The Germans had achieved strategic surprise despite numerous warning signs that American and British intelligence had shared with Moscow. Stalin had dismissed the warnings, convinced that Hitler would not attack. The result had been catastrophic defeats in the opening weeks of the war that nearly proved fatal. Never again would Soviet leaders allow themselves to be caught unprepared. Never again would they trust assurances from the West. From the American perspective, Soviet actions in Eastern Europe looked like something entirely different. They looked like expansion. They looked like the replacement of Nazi tyranny with a new form of authoritarianism. They looked like a pattern that might not stop at the territories the Red Army had liberated, but might continue westward into countries that were struggling to rebuild their shattered democracies. American observers saw not defensive measures but offensive ambitions. They saw not a search for security but a drive for domination. They saw not a traumatized nation protecting itself but an ideological movement seeking to spread its system across the globe. The same actions viewed through different historical experiences and different ideological frameworks led to completely opposite conclusions about what was happening and what it meant. When one side calls it security and the other side calls it expansion, the conflict has already begun. The alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany was always an alliance of necessity rather than affinity. The United States and the Soviet Union had found themselves on the same side not because they shared values or visions for the world, but because they faced a common enemy that threatened them both. Once that enemy was destroyed, the differences that had been suppressed during the war began to re-emerge with force. These differences were profound. They went beyond mere national interest to fundamental disagreements about how societies should be organized, how economies should function, how governments should relate to their citizens. The gap between the two systems was not a matter of degree but of kind. The American system was built on private property, individual rights, and democratic elections. It assumed that economic freedom and political freedom were connected, that markets and democracy reinforced each other, that the proper role of government was limited and defined by law. These principles were not always perfectly implemented, but they formed the foundation of American self-understanding. The Soviet system was built on state ownership, collective identity, and single-party rule. It assumed that capitalism was inherently exploitative, that bourgeois democracy was a sham concealing the rule of the wealthy, that only the Communist Party could lead the working class to its proper destiny. The state controlled the economy and directed its development according to central plans. Political opposition was not tolerated because it was by definition counter-revolutionary. Here is where the divide becomes unbridgeable. These were not differences that could easily be negotiated away. Each system claimed universal validity. Each believed that history was on its side. Each saw the other not just as a competitor but as a threat to everything it valued. Coexistence might be possible as a temporary expedient, but genuine partnership required a convergence that neither side was willing to contemplate. During the war, these differences had been papered over by the demands of the common struggle. American leaders had spoken optimistically about their Soviet allies. Propaganda had emphasized the heroism of Soviet resistance to Nazi invasion. There was genuine hope in some quarters that the wartime cooperation might continue into the post-war period, that the two great powers might find ways to manage their differences and build a lasting peace together. President Franklin Roosevelt had invested heavily in this hope. He believed that personal relationships between leaders could overcome systemic differences. He thought that if he could just meet with Stalin enough times, if he could demonstrate American goodwill clearly enough, the basis for cooperation could be established. This faith in personal diplomacy would prove to be misplaced, but it was sincerely held. As the war ended, and the practical questions of what would happen next began to be addressed, the differences became harder to ignore. The very things that needed to be decided, the shape of post-war governments, the boundaries of nations, the principles that would govern international relations, these were exactly the questions on which the two systems disagreed most fundamentally. The conferences at Yalta and Potsdam attempted to address these questions, but the agreements reached were ambiguous enough to be interpreted differently by each side. The language of democracy and self-determination meant different things in Washington and Moscow. When the Soviets spoke of democratic governments in Eastern Europe, they meant governments led by communists who would follow Moscow's direction. When the Americans spoke of free elections, they meant competitive contests that might produce any outcome. These different understandings were not initially apparent. The words sounded similar enough that both sides could believe they had reached agreement. Only when the words had to be translated into action did the gulf become clear. The most immediate and contentious questions concerned Europe. What would happen to the countries that had been occupied by Germany and were now being liberated by Allied forces? What kind of governments would they have? What kind of economic systems? What relationship would they have with the major powers that had won the war? In the territories liberated by Western forces, the pattern was relatively clear. Existing governments in exile would be restored where possible. Democratic elections would be held. The countries would be integrated into a Western-oriented economic system based on open trade and market principles. There were complications and exceptions, but the general direction was toward democratic self-determination. In the territories liberated by the Red Army, a different pattern was emerging. Soviet forces had done most of the ground fighting against Germany on the European continent. They had paid a staggering price in blood for every mile of territory recaptured, and as they advanced, they brought with them not just liberation from Nazi occupation, but the installation of political systems favorable to Moscow. This process was visible to American observers, and it contradicted everything they believed the war had been fought to achieve. The Soviet Union did not need to invade with tanks to gain ground. It only needed to consolidate political control. The method of Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe deserves careful examination because it established a pattern that would recur throughout the Cold War. Understanding this pattern was essential for American strategists trying to develop a response, and it remains essential for anyone trying to understand why the Cold War developed as it did. The Soviet approach rarely involved direct military conquest in the traditional sense. The Red Army had already occupied the territories in question as part of the campaign against Germany. The soldiers were already there. The question was what would happen next, how the political future of these countries would be shaped. The process typically began with the establishment of coalition governments that included communists alongside other parties. These coalitions gave the appearance of democratic pluralism and allowed the Soviet Union to claim that it was respecting the principles of self-determination that had been agreed upon by the wartime allies. On paper, multiple parties existed. On paper, elections were held. On paper, the forms of democracy were observed. But within these coalitions, the communists held key positions, particularly in the ministries that controlled security forces and police. This gave them disproportionate power to shape events even when they were nominally only one party among several. Control of the security apparatus meant control of who could organize, who could speak freely, who could be arrested and who could not. Consider what this meant in practice. A politician from a non-communist party might give a speech criticizing government policy. The next day, he might be visited by security police asking questions about his associations. His family might face difficulties at work or school. His ability to travel might be restricted. Nothing dramatic, nothing that made headlines, but a steady pressure that made opposition increasingly costly. Over time, the non-communist parties in these coalitions were weakened and eventually eliminated. Opposition leaders faced harassment, trumped-up charges, show trials, or simple disappearance. Independent newspapers were shut down or taken over. Civil society organizations were subordinated to party control. Trade unions, professional associations, cultural organizations, all were brought under the direction of the Communist Party. The process was sometimes called salami tactics, a phrase attributed to Hungarian communist leader Matyas Rákosi. The opposition was sliced away bit by bit, each slice too thin to provoke a crisis, but the cumulative effect was the elimination of all alternatives to communist rule. The pattern varied somewhat from country to country depending on local circumstances, but the outcome was consistent. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and eventually Czechoslovakia all ended up with communist governments that took their direction from Moscow. The timing and specific methods differed, but the result was the same. This method of expansion was particularly difficult to counter because it operated in a gray zone. It was not open military aggression of the kind that would clearly justify a military response. It was political manipulation, sometimes with the appearance of legality, conducted within the borders of countries that were nominally sovereign. Responding with force would have meant starting a war over internal political processes in countries far from American shores. But failing to respond meant watching as country after country fell into the Soviet orbit. Each success emboldened further efforts. Each new communist government added to Soviet strategic depth and economic resources. The pattern seemed to feed on itself, each step making the next one easier. For American policymakers, this created a dilemma that would persist throughout the Cold War. How do you counter an adversary who advances through means short of war? How do you draw lines when the violations are ambiguous? How do you maintain the will to resist when each individual step seems too small to justify a major confrontation, but the cumulative effect is transformative? The challenge was particularly acute because American public opinion was tired of war. The soldiers who had fought in Europe and the Pacific wanted to come home. Families who had sacrificed for years wanted to return to normal life. The idea of a new confrontation, of maintaining military readiness indefinitely, of taking on new commitments abroad, was not popular. Making the case for sustained resistance to Soviet expansion required persuading a war-weary public that the sacrifice was necessary. Confronting an advance that came without a declaration of war would require a new kind of strategy. The American response to Soviet expansion developed gradually over the period from 1945 to 1947. It was not the result of a single decision or a single document, but of a cumulative recognition that the hopes for post-war cooperation were not going to be realized, and that a new strategy was needed. The shift in American thinking can be traced through the changing assessments of key officials. In 1945, there was still significant optimism about the possibility of working with the Soviet Union. President Roosevelt had invested heavily in building a personal relationship with Stalin. There was hope that the wartime alliance might evolve into a system for managing great power relations that would prevent future conflicts. Roosevelt died in April 1945, just weeks before the German surrender. His successor, Harry Truman, came to office with less experience in foreign affairs and less investment in the personal diplomacy that Roosevelt had pursued. Truman was more skeptical of Soviet intentions from the start, though he initially tried to continue Roosevelt's approach. The conferences and negotiations of 1945 produced agreements on paper but growing doubts in private. American officials who dealt directly with their Soviet counterparts reported increasing frustration. The Soviets agreed to general principles but then interpreted them in ways that seemed to contradict their plain meaning. They made commitments and then failed to honor them. The gap between words and actions widened. By early 1946, the optimism was fading rapidly. The pattern of Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe was becoming clearer. Soviet pressure on Iran, where Soviet troops had been stationed during the war and were slow to withdraw, suggested that the expansion might not be limited to Eastern Europe. Soviet demands on Turkey for joint control of the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean raised similar concerns. A critical moment in crystallizing American thinking was the long telegram sent from Moscow in February 1946 by diplomat George Kennan. In this extended analysis, running to several thousand words, Kennan argued that Soviet hostility toward the West was rooted in the internal dynamics of the Soviet system rather than in legitimate security concerns. Kennan contended that the Soviet leadership needed external enemies to justify its internal repression. The ideology of Marxism-Leninism required a hostile capitalist world as the foil against which Soviet virtue could be defined. No amount of Western accommodation would change this fundamental orientation because the hostility served essential functions within the Soviet system itself. This analysis had profound implications for policy. If Soviet hostility was not based on legitimate grievances that could be addressed, then accommodation was pointless. Trying to reassure the Soviets would be interpreted as weakness. Making concessions would only encourage further demands. The appropriate response was not to seek compromise, but to firmly resist expansion wherever it occurred. Kennan's concept of containment would become the intellectual foundation of American Cold War strategy. The idea was not to destroy the Soviet Union or to roll back its control of Eastern Europe, which would risk a catastrophic war. The idea was to contain Soviet influence within its existing boundaries, to prevent further expansion, and to wait for internal changes within the Soviet system that might eventually make peaceful coexistence possible. This was a strategy for the long term. It assumed that the confrontation would last for years, perhaps decades. It required patience, consistency, and a sustained commitment of resources. It meant accepting that the problem would not be solved quickly but would have to be managed indefinitely. In 1946, containment was still an idea being debated rather than a settled policy. The question was whether the American public and its leaders were ready to accept the commitment that containment would require. The tradition of American isolation from European power politics was strong. The desire to return to normal life after the war was powerful. Making the case for a permanent American role in containing Soviet expansion was not a simple matter. The answer came in 1947, through a series of events that forced decisions that might otherwise have been delayed. Here is where the commitment becomes concrete. The winter of 1946-47 was brutal across Europe. The temperatures were among the coldest on record. Fuel was scarce. Food was short. The already struggling economies of war-devastated countries were pushed to the breaking point. The suffering was immense and visible. In Britain, the situation was particularly acute. The country that had stood alone against Hitler in 1940, that had been America's closest ally throughout the war, was exhausted and nearly bankrupt. The costs of the war had drained the British treasury. The empire that had once spanned the globe was becoming unsustainable. The British government was being forced to reduce its commitments abroad, to withdraw from positions it had maintained for generations. In February 1947, the British government informed Washington that it could no longer afford to maintain its support for the governments of Greece and Turkey. Both countries were facing pressure that American policymakers interpreted as Soviet-backed or Soviet-inspired. Greece was in the midst of a civil war. Communist forces were fighting against the government, receiving support from neighboring communist countries. The government was weak, corrupt, and struggling to maintain control. Without external support, its collapse seemed possible, perhaps probable. Turkey was under direct Soviet pressure. The Soviet Union was demanding joint control of the straits, the narrow waterways connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. These straits had enormous strategic significance. Whoever controlled them controlled access between the Soviet Union's southern ports and the wider world. Soviet demands were accompanied by military pressure, with Soviet forces massing in areas near the Turkish border. The British withdrawal created a crisis that demanded an American response. If the United States did nothing, two strategically important countries at the intersection of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East might fall under Soviet influence. The consequences for the regional balance of power would be severe. The signal to other countries facing Soviet pressure would be devastating. But responding was not simple. The American public was not eager for new international commitments. The rapid demobilization after the war had reduced American military forces dramatically. Congress, now controlled by Republicans after the 1946 elections, was focused on cutting spending and reducing taxes, not on new foreign adventures. President Truman decided to act. But he understood that the case had to be made carefully. The specific situations in Greece and Turkey were complicated, involving local politics and histories that most Americans knew little about. The broader principle, that the United States had to take responsibility for containing Soviet expansion, needed to be articulated in terms that would generate broad support. The result was what became known as the Truman Doctrine. In a speech to Congress in March 1947, Truman declared that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The language was deliberately broad. It extended far beyond the immediate cases of Greece and Turkey to establish a general principle of American engagement in resisting communist expansion wherever it occurred. Truman was not just asking for aid to two specific countries. He was asking Congress and the American people to accept a new role in the world, a permanent commitment to containing the spread of Soviet influence. The speech worked. Congress approved the aid for Greece and Turkey. More importantly, the principle was established. The United States would not stand by while the Soviet Union extended its control over additional countries. Lines would be drawn. Pressure would be resisted. The era of American isolation from European power politics was definitively over. The Truman Doctrine marked a decisive break with tradition. It committed the United States to an active role in containing Soviet influence, a commitment that would require sustained effort and resources over an indefinite period. It established that American security was connected to the security of countries far from American shores, and that the United States would act to defend that connection. Even a war-weary public, when presented with the stakes clearly, was willing to accept that responsibility. Several other decisions in this period reinforced the emerging pattern of Cold War confrontation and made the division of the world more durable. The question of Germany's future was among the most consequential. The former enemy had been divided into occupation zones administered by the victorious powers. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union each controlled a sector. Berlin, though deep within the Soviet zone, was similarly divided among the four powers. The original intention had been temporary occupation followed by reunification under a new German government. Germany would be demilitarized, denazified, and eventually restored to the community of nations as a peaceful democracy. The occupation was supposed to be a transition, not a permanent arrangement. But disagreements among the occupying powers made reunification increasingly unlikely. The fundamental question was what kind of Germany would emerge. A unified Germany aligned with the West would be a major addition to the anti-Soviet coalition. A unified Germany aligned with the East would shift the balance of power dramatically against the West. A neutral Germany might be unstable, tempting both sides to compete for influence. The Soviet zone in eastern Germany was being organized along communist lines. Land was redistributed. Industry was nationalized. Political parties other than the communists were marginalized or absorbed. The pattern visible elsewhere in Eastern Europe was being repeated in the Soviet occupation zone. The Western zones, administered by the United States, Britain, and France, were moving in a different direction. Economic recovery was being prioritized. Market principles were being restored. Political parties were allowed to organize freely. The three Western zones were increasingly being coordinated as a single economic unit, a precursor to the political unification that would eventually produce the Federal Republic of Germany. The division that was supposed to be temporary was becoming entrenched. Neither side was willing to accept reunification on the other's terms. Neither side was willing to risk losing Germany entirely to the opposing camp. The result was partition, a solution that no one had originally intended, but that became the only alternative to endless confrontation. This division would eventually produce two German states, one aligned with each superpower, a physical manifestation of the broader European split. The Berlin Wall, which would come later, was the most visible symbol of this division, but the reality was established in these early post-war years. Germany, the country whose aggression had caused the war, became the front line of the peace that followed. The Marshall Plan, announced in June 1947, was another decision that deepened the divide. Secretary of State George Marshall proposed a comprehensive program of American economic aid to help European countries recover from the devastation of war. The scale of what Marshall proposed was unprecedented. Billions of dollars would be provided to help rebuild European economies. The aid would support recovery in agriculture, industry, and infrastructure. It would help stabilize currencies and restore trade. It would provide the foundation for economic growth that would make European democracies strong enough to resist both internal subversion and external pressure. American production and wealth, the same industrial capacity that had helped win the war, would now be turned toward building stability. The productive power of the American economy became a strategic asset in a different kind of conflict. The offer was nominally open to all European countries, including those in the Soviet sphere. Marshall made clear that the program was directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Any country willing to participate in a coordinated recovery program could receive aid. But the conditions attached to the aid were incompatible with the Soviet economic model. Participating countries would need to open their economic data to scrutiny. They would need to coordinate their recovery plans with other participating nations. They would need to accept a degree of integration with the American-led economic system that the Soviet Union found threatening. The Soviet Union rejected the Marshall Plan and pressured countries in its sphere to do the same. Czechoslovakia initially expressed interest in participating but was forced to withdraw under Soviet pressure. Poland and other Eastern European countries were similarly prevented from joining. This rejection confirmed the division of Europe into two economic blocs. Western Europe would rebuild with American help under a market-oriented system. Eastern Europe would develop under Soviet direction according to communist economic principles. The economic integration of Western Europe that the Marshall Plan fostered would eventually lead to political integration as well, creating institutions that persist to this day. The Marshall Plan was not just an act of generosity, though the humanitarian motives were real. It was also a strategic investment in creating a Western Europe strong enough to resist Soviet pressure. A prosperous Europe would be a stable Europe. A stable Europe would be an ally in the broader competition with the Soviet Union. The economic recovery that the Marshall Plan enabled became the foundation of the Western alliance system. Each of these decisions, the Truman Doctrine, the division of Germany, the Marshall Plan, reduced the space for ambiguity and increased the logic of opposing blocs. Each step toward consolidating the Western position was matched by Soviet steps to consolidate control in the East. The pattern was self-reinforcing. Actions taken for defensive purposes by one side were perceived as threatening by the other, prompting responses that further escalated the confrontation. By the end of 1947, the world was no longer moving toward a settlement. It was moving toward alignment into two hostile camps. The decisions of 1945 to 1947 created the structure within which the Cold War would be fought for the next 4 decades. Every subsequent crisis, every confrontation, every near miss with disaster grew out of the fundamental division established in these early years. The logic of the Cold War was set. Two superpowers, each convinced of its own righteousness and the other's dangerous intentions. nuclear arsenals that would grow steadily in destructive capacity, alliance systems binding smaller nations to the great power competition, ideological visions claiming universal validity and seeking to demonstrate their superiority. Within this structure, an entirely new form of international competition would develop. Not war in the traditional sense, because the stakes of nuclear conflict were too high for direct confrontation. But not peace either, because the underlying hostility was too deep for genuine accommodation. Instead, a sustained state of tension that manifested in proxy conflicts, espionage, propaganda, economic competition, and the development of weapons systems designed to deter the war that neither side wanted but both had to prepare for. The confrontation would play out across the globe. In Europe, the front line was the boundary between East and West Germany, where millions of soldiers faced each other across a divided continent. In Asia, the competition would produce hot wars in Korea and Vietnam. In Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, the superpowers would support opposing factions in local conflicts, turning civil wars into proxy battles. The arsenals that both sides built were staggering in their destructive potential. By the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy human civilization several times over. The strategy of mutual assured destruction, the grim recognition that any nuclear war would end with the annihilation of both sides, was supposed to prevent such a war from starting. But it also meant that any miscalculation, any accident, any moment of panic could trigger consequences beyond comprehension. The people who would actually conduct this competition, the pilots who would fly reconnaissance missions over hostile territory, the sailors who would track submarines through the depths, the analysts who would study intercepted communications for clues to enemy intentions, the soldiers who would face each other across divided borders, none of them had chosen this conflict. It had been chosen for them by decisions made in the years immediately after the Second World War. These were ordinary people, most of them young, asked to carry out missions of extraordinary importance and danger. They trained for scenarios they hoped would never happen. They maintained vigilance through years of tension punctuated by moments of crisis. They developed expertise in technologies designed for destruction. And they operated within systems where a single error could have catastrophic consequences. This is the context for everything that would follow in the Cold War. The decisions examined in this account created the conditions. The files and operations examined in subsequent accounts show how those conditions played out in practice. The grand strategy debated in Washington and Moscow became missions assigned to individuals who would have to execute them under pressure, often with incomplete information, always with the knowledge that mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. The Cold War did not begin with a shot fired. It began when both sides accepted that the other would not back down without resistance. The question posed at the beginning of this account was simple. How do you stop an enemy without starting another world war? The period from 1945 to 1947 provided the beginning of an answer. Containment, resistance to expansion, the drawing of lines that could not be crossed without consequence, patience combined with firmness, strength demonstrated without aggression. But stating a strategy is not the same as implementing it. The years ahead would test whether the commitment made in 1947 could be sustained, whether the lines drawn would hold, whether the balance of power could be maintained without tipping into the catastrophic conflict that everyone feared, whether the patience required for a long struggle could be maintained in a democracy where public opinion shifted and elections changed governments. The costs would be enormous. Trillions of dollars spent on weapons, millions of lives shaped by military service, countless crises that brought the world to the edge of destruction, the opportunity costs of resources devoted to competition rather than human welfare, the moral compromises made in the name of opposing a greater threat. The benefits, if that is the right word, would be the war that did not happen. The nuclear weapons that were never used after 1945. The confrontation that remained cold instead of turning hot. The space created for Western Europe to rebuild and prosper. The eventual collapse of the Soviet system, though that outcome was far from certain during the decades of confrontation. Whether the Cold War was necessary, whether it could have been avoided, whether the strategies pursued were the right ones, these are questions that historians and policymakers continue to debate. What is clear is that the decisions made in the immediate post-war years set the world on a course that would define the second half of the 20th century. The decisions that split the world had been made. The consequences would unfold over the next 4 decades, in every corner of the globe, in crises that brought humanity to the edge of destruction, and in quiet operations that most people would never know about. Now Washington had an answer. The next question was whether it could sell that answer to its own people. The Cold War started as a question. How do you stop an enemy without starting a world war? In 1947, Washington chose its answer, and it came with a name. The Truman Doctrine.